I opened my eyes to a world without colour, the same world I'd always known as long as memory allowed. I pushed back my blanket and rolled it up as tight as it would go before slipping it into my rucksack. In the hazy corridor visible through the doorway on the far side of the room, I could see people slowly moving past, heads down, a heavy silence hanging low over them like a cover of dark, unyielding clouds. They were going up, always up. I moved to the doorway and peered past the crowd, out through a grimy, half-open window and into open air. Moving forwards, I pushed through a group of 3 and went to stand at it. I had seen the sight thousands of times before, yet each morning something always compelled me to step up to the windows and look again. A clothesline hung from one side of the tower to the other, over the yawning gap at the centre of the world, or at least the world we knew. And oh, what a world it was! Greyscale, hazy, with a 15 by 15 metre core of abyss enclosed by concrete walls of endless height, interrupted by an infinite chaotic array of glass windows and inset balconies, and the very occasional door out into nothing, the mere presence of which suggested something I preferred not to dwell on. I craned my neck and looked up. Somewhere up there, amidst the gathering grey that obscured all hints of what we might be climbing to, light shone. By the time it reached this far down, it was pallid and faint, but it never wavered. Night, like colour, was a thing we knew of, but had never seen. Sleep came only when our eyes drooped and our legs would go no further, morning, at the whims of restless chance. I looked down. Darkness met my gaze. As the concrete walls stretched low the way we'd come, shadows gathered and eventually engulfed everything. Just as we couldn't see what we were climbing towards, neither could we see what we'd left behind, if there was a bottom or if the world kept going forever. And that shadow, no matter how far or fast I climbed, it was always just as close. I felt sometimes, as I looked into it, that it was looking back at me, into me. I had spent long hours wondering if it was just an illusion of the world, if the people down there saw everything the same as I did, or if as I climbed the darkness followed me and consumed all in its path. I was quite sure it was the former, quite sure that it was simply a law of the world that each person should always live in the same pale light, but I was never brave enough to test that theory, to turn back. No one ever turned back. No one ever moved down, not by choice. Such thoughts, I decided, had held me at that window long enough. There were people who lingered too long on one floor and became unable to move on, who claimed rooms to call their own homes and were stuck forever in stasis. The frozen, we called them. They lived out the same days over and over again in the same place, going nowhere. It was a fate worse than descent, and some said, if you loitered too long, the walls would call to you like sirens on the rocks, beg you to stay. And then you would be lost. I stepped away from the window and started my climb for the day. A faster walker than most, I moved along the outside of the steady trudging stream of figures, my rucksack strapped tightly about my chest and waist. Most of what I carried was clothing and blankets. There wasn't much to be said for holding food around in the tower. Every floor had an endless yet somehow short supply, so that we were always hungry but never starving. The only nutrition I carried with me was a large plastic bottle for water, refilled at the taps that could be found along the hallways every now and then. The strange thing about life in the tower was how it all seemed to weigh on you so strongly, and yet it never became too much. Even the frozen had not stayed still because their will was broken or because settled life had seemed more appealing to them. They had stayed because the walls had sung to them, and the song was something you couldn't avoid once it had you in its thrall. Though each day was the same as the last, though nothing seemed to change much, and for all I knew we might be climbing the same 100 or so floors over again each day, though the world was all grey and haze, though every night passed by dreamless, and though in the end all friends and family we had ever known befell some trap or other, be it plague, descent, or terrible stasis, the climb never seemed impossible. Perhaps it was because we knew it was all there was, because in lieu of all other goals we marched to the one we could hope of. Or perhaps it was simply because that is how people are in this world. But there were times when I did wonder, if this is all the world is, how do we know of day and night? How do we know of colour and dreams and of all the things beyond this drear eternal march? And those were the times when I paused and looked into the hallways leading out away from the centre of the tower. Long, empty corridors lined with doors stretching like fingers out from the repeating halls that wrapped about the centre again and again, rising so slowly. Corridors that led who knows where. Corridors we all knew not to look at, whose ends were, as the depths, all wrapped in shadow, whose insidious whispers sought to tempt us from the path up towards that light we coveted and endlessly, fruitlessly pursued like moths against a window. And those corridors, in those moments, they beckoned. Our steady trudging ascent rarely saw interruption. The most interesting part of each day was when we reached the end of a floor and climbed the 30 cold stone steps up to the next one, only to there repeat the process all over again. In my younger years, I had taken to counting the number of floors I passed in a day. I had even found a small leather-bound diary and a beaten old metal pen to tally them up, and every time I settled down to sleep I'd compare them to the previous day, and the numbers would be the same. 16 or so hours, 500 floors, every day, for eternity. Sometimes I tried to walk faster, others slower, but somehow the count always came out the same, as though it were some law of the world, like the dark below and light above, or the food that never ran out, or the songs in the walls that lulled you to stasis. Such a law itself beckoned to stay, for it made me wonder, was to linger behind the only way to change that 500 into something else? To stop moving? To freeze? There was no chance of that. I was few things and weak of will was not among them. I had long since stopped keeping record in that diary because I knew that in the end it didn't matter. In the end I would keep going no matter how many floors there were and no matter how fast or slow I took them. How many years had I lived? 30, thereabouts? How many floors had I seen in that time? All were the same, yet when I closed my eyes to slip into sleep, the darkness found me content and accomplished. I was going somewhere. I was going up. From time to time, the climb led me past the dead and dying. The elderly, too weak to carry on, collapsed by the wayside and were condemned to watch as the world passed them by. Sometimes their younger relatives stayed with them, but more often than not, they had no one, or those they did have simply abandoned them, too afraid to stop in case they never started again. There was plague in the tower, hunger, hazard, and strife, but the greatest killer of all was time. With a mind held strong as the years flew by like sand flowing to the bottom of an hourglass, the body weakened. In the end, it didn't matter how resolute you were, how fiercely you longed to keep going, keep ascending, break through the endless repetition and reach the light. Your muscles withered, your skin drooped, your bones ached, and your body failed. Time always has its due in the end. Then there were the skeletons. Echoes of a person who had once been, who had put their life towards the climb, the same as the rest of us, and ended up where? Here? By my feet as I moved to climb the steps to a new floor? Their skull was cracked, missing several teeth, and stared back at me with black, helpless eyes, and I wondered if the thing some people called a soul might be in there, still trapped in those dusty old bones. If all the reward for carrying on was to crumble away until only your brittle frame was left behind to remind those who passed them by that someone had once been there, but tell them nothing of who you were, then what really was the point of it all? When one skeleton could so easily be swapped for another and no one would know the difference, was there really anything left to suggest you had ever existed in the first place? As I reached the top of the stairs, my gaze fell on a sight I had seen only a handful of times before. They were frozen here, so many of them crouched in doorways wrapped in blankets, coughing into their arms. That alone would have been a horror to look upon, to see so many souls imprisoned on a single floor, but the real danger, the danger to me, was plain to see on the boils peppering the face of the small frozen boy who raised his eyes to look up at me. I reached round to one of the pockets of my rucksack and pulled out a mask, placing it over my mouth and nose as the boy looked away again, his interest in me dissipating. I had come upon a plague sector. There would be a dozen or so floors of it, each full to the bursting with the infected. Though their symptoms could vary, they all carried the same ill, a pathogen that permeated the air and swam in their blood and tears and crawled just below their skin, begging them to reach out and touch, to cry for help, to spread its spores. Fortunately, they were slow and weak and mostly kept at the doorways and the rooms at the side, so it was easy enough to avoid them. Still, you had to be careful. If they touched you... I came to a halt, faced with one of the nurses who had been walking with her head down and almost collided with me. Taking a step back, I gave a small nod and edged around her, keeping my hands behind my back. The nurses had been touched, and now they stayed behind to help those more sickly than them, in the knowledge that they would one day become just the same. I had never been quite clear on how quickly the plague progressed, how long it was before you could no longer help yourself and collapsed into one of the rooms to await a nurse of your own. But some part of me felt it was probably years. Nothing happened too quickly in the tower. Nothing except that one moment, that one instant of horror you felt as your hands brushed ever so softly against the skin of the infected. At least, that was how the dying old man I had once met far, far below had described it to me. I remembered that man's face well, better than my own lost family's. He had been so gaunt, his skin stretched so taut like tape across his face that I had thought even then he could only be days from becoming a skeleton himself. But he had talked to me in his frail, rasping voice, told me of the ails that befell him, of the fury he felt towards his legs as they refused to carry him any further. But that had been years ago. I didn't speak to the ill anymore. I didn't speak to any of the frozen. I heeded his words, his dying wish for me, a stranger with whom he had spent at most 10 minutes. I kept going up. The thing that frightened me most about the plague sectors was how thin the line of walkers was drawn. I couldn't take my normal path along the edge of the group, couldn't jump forwards or push through. I was forced to the same crawling pace as everyone else. I kept my hands close to my chest and my eyes darting around as we moved forwards, my attention jumping from frozen to frozen as I watched their movements with care. Not everyone treated danger with the same precaution. Sometimes I came across people whose survival into adulthood was nothing short of a miracle, if miracles could really be believed in, who seemed to possess such dwindling regard for their own security or that of those around them that I had to wonder how they even made it through a single day. It wasn't that they were brave beyond their merits or hurled themselves willingly into danger, it was just that they paid so little attention to the world around them. I would see them walking with their heads down, their pace hurried along the outside of the line no matter the circumstance. Where I knew when to join the crowd, their impatience drove them ever faster. There was one approaching now. The first I knew of it was the vague sound of muttering and shuffling, a noise that drew a turn of the head from me as I glanced over my shoulder. This particular fool had more obstinance than most, pushing people out of his way as he shoved alongside the line. There was a little awareness in him at least as he tried to keep close to the centre, but his haste to move on was putting himself, and all those around him, in danger. As he reached me, I took a small preemptive step as far sideways as I could afford in good confidence and muttered a few words of hurried advice. "Slow down or you'll get someone infected." He didn't pay me any mind. Perhaps he hadn't heard me, or if he had, perhaps the words had simply drifted in one ear and out of the other as a leaf upon the wind. That was always the way with things when I tried to help someone. If they listened to my advice enough to grasp the meaning of the words, then they'd still consciously discard it. I'd spent a while wondering if it was the way I worded things, or something to do with my looks, but everyone in the world was gruff and tired and dirty. I'd long since concluded that many people simply didn't want to be helped. To do that, they'd have to admit they had a problem. Was that how the old man had felt? The one who'd told me so long ago to keep going? Had he longed for years, decades even, to have but a single word he spoke heeded by those who needed it? Had I provided him some solace then in his final moments, that his last act would have at least some impact on someone's life somewhere, even if in the end that life would amount to just as little as his own? Maybe then it was duty that spurred me to try again and again after every failure, to pass on the legacy. If his words carried me to help another, and them to another, over and over, then in some small way, he would live forever. My thoughts fading away into a cold blankness of mind, I watched the careless man push ahead. Wise people stepped aside as I had, people like him were shoved aside. One stumbled, and I held my breath as I thought they might fall, but they caught themselves and slipped back into the line. A lucky survivor. I watched as the frozen they'd wavered beside slowly retracted their hand. The fool pushed on, disappearing around the corner and out of sight. I thought I might make a silent bet with myself on whether I'd see him again, but as I turned that same corner it was already over. I watched shuffling forwards with the line as he sank to his knees by the side of the corridor and stared at his hand. When I reached him I looked down and saw his eyes were wide with fear. Beside him, one of the frozen still sat with her arm outstretched. I closed my eyes briefly. "I'm sorry," I told the man quietly as we moved past. "I warned you." He didn't reply. I never believed in gods in my youth. You grew up hearing of the legends of creators and protectors, rulers on high who forged the world from nothing and raised humanity from the earth, who made the world as it is all in aid of some great and unknowable aim. Some people call them benevolent, others call them destroyers, and some people say that they just are. I never believed in gods because I didn't think any of them would make a world like this. Not because they wouldn't condemn their creations to such damning existence, but because if I were a god, this world would bore me terribly. But over the years I had found faith in something beyond the world of matter and sense. Not exactly a will or intent, nothing quite so advanced as all that, but a thing which, given a watchful eye and an attentive mind, I was sure anyone should be able to observe. I saw it then, looking back at that kneeling man who had until that moment lived with such disregard for himself and his actions. The memory that the future holds of the past, it holds strong. Sometimes the repercussions were swift, sometimes they were slow, but every action impressed itself upon an individual like a mark on their skin. A seed sown without care will always reap a cruel crop. Then something shattered my thoughts. There was a commotion ahead, shouting, a scuffle between two figures I couldn't make out at the base of the stairs. The line came to a halt. My breath caught in my throat as my heart quickened. Such a thing, this cessation of the ever-upwards movement, had only happened once before in all my time. It had terrified me then as I had lost myself in the thought that walls might sing to me, but now, here, with the infected all around. I lowered my head and placed a hand over my eyes, counting slowly under my breath. That was the way my mother had taught me before I lost her. Count. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 50. Slow your breath. Slow your heart. Be calm, but be alert. I slid my hand down below my eyes and looked up. Whatever was happening hadn't quietened down. It was getting louder. I glanced to my right and saw one of the corridors, its shadowy lengths receding from me so far away until the darkness consumed them altogether and I could see no further. When the faintest cool breeze tickled my hair against my neck, it seemed that the corridor had breathed a whisper so faint it was almost silent. The ridiculousness of my situation drew a small laugh from me and in turn a frown and a glance from the person behind me. When my eyes returned to the corridor, I saw someone flit past. They were quick, quiet, dressed darkly, moving from one door to the other in almost the blink of an eye. But I saw them. No one was in the corridors. No one went there. No one even spoke about the corridors. I glanced back towards the stairs. The commotion was growing. Somehow something had sparked the people out of furious confrontation, and a fire once stoked flares all the brighter. I saw a fist thrown. I had never seen violence before, and yet something about these people. They were all so ready to indulge, to rain blows against one another's bodies until someone gave in. And that chaos had begun to spread back the way. As some people tried to stop the violence and others tried to propagate it, it jumped from mind to mind like a song that begs all who hear to tap their feet in time and join the dance. I looked to my left. One of the frozen sat there, infected, staring towards the fight that was falling down the line towards me. I couldn't move left. I moved right, sidestepping out of the line between the grasping hands of two more infected and into... Two walls stood on either side of me. I looked back out through the dark rectangle of a tunnel's end into the line. It was a window back to the world I knew, a world in which, just as soon as it had flared, the flame of violence sizzled out, and the sombre silence of my world fell back over the walkers and the frozen. Peering out from the corridor, I couldn't see what might have stopped it, but no one nearby looked at all fazed. They shuffled forwards as they always did, as if nothing had happened. In my mind, I told myself to take a step forwards and rejoin them. I wasn't going any further up if I just stood here in this dim corridor and watched the world pass me by. There was nothing to be had in the corridors, else everyone would have entered them. They were nothing but a false promise or the world's alternative to the concept we called dreams, something to tug us away from the real and into fantasy, something that if we listened too closely to, gave even the slightest inroad into our minds, would snatch them away and pull us into darkness. At least, that was what I had always thought. Why else would not a single person in all the world have ever mentioned them? If I stayed here too long, I'd be frozen. Around the centre or in the corridors, walls were walls and walls sang. Why wasn't I going back to all that was normal? I turned around and peered into the shadows, remembering the figure I'd seen flit across. Had they been like me? Had they stepped in from the stairs? Had they become lost? Or was there more to the world than what I knew? Against all wisdom and good judgment, contrary to my very thoughts as they railed against my actions, I began to walk down the corridor. Although it was only a few meters to the first door, I witnessed those steps over the course of what seemed to me 1,000 years. It was as if some vast and terrible weight, a burden I never even knew I had carried, was being lifted from me, and with that relief I grew light as a feather and thought I might float to the ceiling. Instead, I realized I was falling and quickly put out a hand to catch myself. As soon as it touched the smooth, cold surface of the wall, time snapped back to full speed. I took a deep breath and steadied myself against the wall. The relief that had swamped me only moments ago was already turning sour in my mouth as fear bubbled up amongst it. My hand curled around the doorknob, not a thing I'd ever touched before. The rooms we used for sleep had only empty doorways. I stood ready to open this real, solid door, this barrier between me and the knowledge of whatever lay in the room beyond. How long could I keep going before all chance of return was lost? A voice came to me, frail as a whisper and faint as an echo of a memory from long ago. An old, rasping voice that told me, "Keep going up." I wasn't going up. Where was I going? If I was lost to this temptation, this yawning, beckoning maw that sought to swallow me, that had lived insidious life for so long in my periphery, who would carry that memory any longer? Who would carry forwards the last words of a failing old man, and what did it mean if no one could? Memories came and went faster than the beat of a heart. Every moment I lived, a million ancient and treasured things were forgotten forever, and a million new and exciting were witnessed and remembered. In the face of all that, what was it really worth to try so hard to dedicate my life and my own memories to one man I'd known so briefly? Before I even had a chance to make the decision myself, my hand seemed to turn of its own accord, twisting the doorknob around and pushing inwards. Inside was dimly lit. It was spacious, rectangular, carpeted with a flickering low yellow light in the ceiling. Empty. There was no furniture, no windows, no other doors, and no people. Suddenly doubting myself, I backed out of it and crossed the corridor to the room opposite, but that one was the same, the exact twin, no, the exact mirror of the first. Was that all the corridors had to offer? The same room over and over again, stretching out for eternity? Nothing but the tower on another axis? With that thought, a sudden desperation grasped me. This couldn't be all there was. There had to be something beyond the tower and the endless, progressionless movement, something beyond a vague and empty finish line I would never reach. Dreams, I reminded myself. I know what dreams are. I pressed further on, further down the corridor. Behind me, the light from the stairway dwindled and died away until I was fully enveloped in the shadows of the world beyond mine. There were other doors. I tried each one I came across. A minuscule few were locked, and all those I could step through led to either empty rooms or more corridors with more doors. I had moved from an unending yet comfortably predictable staircase to a labyrinth of chaos and uncertainty. By the time it occurred to me again that perhaps I should turn back, I had forgotten the way. I slumped down against one of the walls and let my head fall into my hands. What sort of madness had made me throw away my world for this darkness and solitude? How stupid did I have to be to listen to the temptations of the corridors, a song so much more subtle yet infinitely more sinister than even that of the walls? I wasn't frozen, but what was I? Nothing? No one? Here, where no one else ever set foot, where there was no food or fountains to replenish my supplies, where I would die, and the words of an old man would die with me? Don't tell me you've given up already. My head snapped up so fast I felt a little light for a moment. As my focus returned, I found myself face to face with a young woman with a curious look in her dark eyes, her head tilted as she sat across the corridor from me, knees drawn up to her chest, watching. It was only as I opened my mouth to reply that I realized I could, in some wavering, non-committal sense, see through her and to the wall she sat with her back to. "You've barely been here a few hours," she continued. "You have to keep going. I sat down like you and look how I turned out. If you stay here, you'll be found." Had it been hours already? I shook my head, still trying to work out whether she was actually there or if I was hallucinating. "Are you dead?" She frowned. "Well, not exactly. But I can tell you I don't remember things well. I just wander mostly. That's not a good life. You need to find one of the locked doors. Kick it in if you have to and go through. It'll be dark, but you have to do it or you'll end up the same as me." Slowly, I clambered to my feet. In response, the woman rose with grace, almost inhumanly, as though her body simply floated into a standing position. I began, but she held up a finger. "You need to go." She cocked her head and a shadow seemed to come over her face. "They're on their way. No one's supposed to end up here or even know here exists, but sometimes we do, so they clean us up. You don't want that. Go now. Find a locked door, get it open, go through. And if you hear them coming, run. Go now!" I wasn't sure how long I'd been moving for. I hadn't stopped since I'd left the woman behind to face whomever they had told me to run from, but how long ago that was had already slipped my mind. I imagined that the walls had fingers, and those fingers reached into the top of my head and rummaged about in my mind until they found the memories they were looking for and tugged them out. Already the smaller details of my life were beginning to slip into their grasp, into the grasp of this place, these corridors. Was their purpose just to lure in unlucky souls like me or that woman and drain away our memory? Was this what had happened to her? Would I begin to fade and turn translucent too? No. I still had an old man to remember, so I focused on that. If I kept the memory in mind, then my grip would be strong. Nothing could snatch it away. I couldn't allow myself to become like the woman, trapped in such uncertain existence, my presence never truly manifesting again. Not when I now had the memories of two people to carry forwards. Two people who had told me to keep going, who had been fading in one way or another, whose words echoed around my head in chorus. The burden of one legacy had been heavy enough. How was I to carry another? I stopped suddenly, brought up short by a noise from behind me. I stood in the middle of one of those empty rooms, doors on either side of me leading to more corridors, and through the one I'd entered came the faint sound of footsteps. Tap, tap, tap against the smooth surface of the floor. In the corners of the room, the shadows grew stronger as a stale breeze raised itself on the air, drifting slowly around me, pulling at my hair, beckoning towards the source of the noise. Tap, tap, tap. It was then that I truly realized the woman had never told me what I was running from, nor what they would do if they caught me. "They clean us up," I remembered her saying, and the memory gave me a jolt and a push forwards, and I started walking again. It was becoming clear to me now that I had become accustomed to losing myself in thought throughout my life in the tower. That was a world where things normally happened slowly, if they happened at all. Aside from in the plague sectors, you could generally just keep walking forwards on a sort of autopilot and nothing bad would ever happen to you. In the end, you'd grow old and your hair would turn grey and your skin would wrinkle, and finally you would lie down to sleep, time would have its due, and you would not wake up. But here the rules were different. As I quickened my step, I listened to the footsteps fade, watched the shadows recede, felt the air still once more. Here, something other than time had its due, and if you stalled, it was had all the sooner. I was halfway down the corridor when I stopped again. Something was wrong. I cocked my head and listened carefully. For a moment, nothing. Then there it was. Tap, tap, tap. Ahead. Had I been turned around? The shadows in the corners reared up and towered over me. How many of them were there? The air picked up and flowed gently between my fingers, urging me forwards and into the embrace of the thing hunting me. How close were they? They were at the very end of the corridor. I could feel that, just around the corner, about to appear. I dodged into one of the empty rooms and closed the door behind me. The frantic movement of my eyes across the far walls told me that there was no other exit. I had cornered myself, and outside I could hear them approach. Tap, tap, tap. There was only one thing I could think of. I sat back against the door, pushing my whole weight against it, screwed my eyes shut, and held my breath. Outside, tap, tap, tap. Closer. Closer. A moment of breathless, crushing silence. The doorknob rattled. I felt the door push against me, but I braced myself and pushed back, defiant. For a moment it relented, then returned a little stronger than before, rattling, pushing. I responded in kind with all the strength I could muster, and for a heart-stopping moment I was certain it would not be enough. And then it stopped. Silence again. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath a while longer, as long as I could, until all the other sounds of the world had dwindled to nothing and the shadows retreated into themselves. Carefully, I opened the door a crack and peered out into the corridor. All I could see was empty, so I pulled it open further and poked my head out, looking both ways to confirm. Standing up, I stepped out and slowly closed the door behind me. It was only as I was about to take a step forwards and look down that I saw the residual presence of the thing that had been outside. Footprints in the dust. They looked like the prints of some kind of shoe, but I wasn't sure what type. All I was sure of was that they would be my trail of breadcrumbs. As long as I was following the footprints, I could be sure I wouldn't be turned around. I started walking again, trying each door I came to, but none to any avail. By now I had to have been walking long enough that I should have come across a locked door. I was certain they hadn't been all that infrequent back before I knew how important they were. Or maybe they had. Or maybe the corridors were peering into me and reshaping themselves according to the things I knew. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. I rounded a corner into another corridor and stopped. The woman was in front of me, a small way down the corridor. She was even fainter than before, so much so that I felt what was behind her was easier to see than she was. Not until I walked up to her did I realize she was hovering just off the ground, her mouth moving soundlessly. I reached out to touch her shoulder in an attempt to get her attention, but my hand went through her. Retracting it, I took a step forward so I was standing beside her. Her gaze did not follow me. Just as I made to move on, I felt something catch my arm. When I looked down, I saw that she was holding onto me, her knuckles turning white with the tightness of her grip. Solid, opaque knuckles. I looked up to a solid face, eyes wide, pupils contracted. "Go now!" she hissed again. And then she was gone. Only empty air remained. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't bother looking back. I ran to the nearest door and tried it. It was locked. Locked, but there was no time to unlock it, no strength in me to break it open. I tried the next door, and it was locked too. And the next, and the next, and the next. All the time I refused to look back. The closer the sound grew, the darker the shadows crowded, the more the air picked up. First about a breath, then a steady breeze that pulled at my hair. Tap, tap, tap. When I looked up, I saw light, the end of the corridor, and beyond it, the tower. My eyes widening, I ran forwards. It was not the escape through the locked doors that the woman had urged, but it was an escape of some sort, an escape back to a world that at least made sense. And yet, as I ran, it seemed to me that something was growing from the edges of the tunnel. Not shadow, not wall, but something clear and hard, like glass. I put my head down and ran faster, reaching down to undo the clasps that held my rucksack on. I would have to jump through before it closed. As my rucksack fell from my shoulders, I stumbled over my own feet for a moment, but picked myself up and kept going, faster. But not fast enough. I collided with what was now a solid, thick wall of glass and stumbled backwards, one hand clutching my head where pain now flared. In front of me stood my world, the line shuffling past as it always did, unaware or uncaring. Turning around, all I could do was stare back down this tunnel of walls and doors that was closed around me. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't see much of what was coming for me, merely the uncertain outline of a thin figure veiled in shadow, walking slowly, deliberately, surely. My ears told me that there were more of them, but I couldn't see where. And then the wall between two doors halfway down the corridor seemed to turn to liquid and fold in on itself, leaving in its wake an opening and the echoing harmony of dozens of shoes, all tap, tap, tapping. I stepped left and slammed my shoulder into the locked door there, knowing it would do no good. It jumped underneath my weight but didn't budge. I suppose that was a little how they had felt when I was blocking the door. But they could not have been so desperate. I kicked at the door, but the action simply put me off balance and I stepped back. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a crack. Tap, tap, tap. The crack ran like thin lightning through the glass where my head had struck it. I kicked at it, and it grew, just a little. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced back down the corridor. I had room to back up, so I walked slowly backwards, then charged again, my shoulder forward, screwing my eyes shut moments before collision. The glass did not shatter exactly, but it broke. A piece of it near the centre seemed to fall out into the tower, except where it had fallen there was only blackness in its place. When I kicked again, more pieces fell away, and then more. The glass was crumbling, and now I could see the pieces fly into the darkness as though it were pulling at them. And maybe it was. The wind had picked up, but now it was blowing the other way, towards the window where the world I knew was collapsing before my very eyes. Behind me, the noise had changed. Tap, 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 tap. They were running, an uneven, limping charge. There was space enough in the glass now, but it was dark. It was void, an abyss. How could I throw myself into that? It'll be dark, the memory of the woman's voice reminded me. But you have to do it, or you'll end up like me. Her command. Go now! The memory of two insignificant, forever lost, nameless souls lived in me. They mattered not to the world or the figures charging at me. They were nothing to time or death or the endless stagnant decay of this reality, and if they were peeled from my head and discarded as I flickered away like a dying flame in these corridors, then no one would notice. But I would remember that I could not remember. Maybe I would meet someone like me and tell them to find a locked door or a window to jump through, but I wouldn't remember why. I would only know that I no longer knew so many things that I should still know. And that was more terrible than anything oblivion could offer. As I jumped, I felt a swipe of air at my neck as one of their hands missed me by centimetres. I crashed through what was left of the window and found myself falling towards shadow, an abyss enclosed by concrete walls of endless height, interrupted by an infinite chaotic array of glass windows and inset balconies, and as a hurtling downwards wind flipped me, I saw the open door from which I had fallen out into nothing. The first thing I knew after that was sound. I could hear wind. Not like the breath of the corridors, but true wind over an open space. I felt it tug at my hair and my clothes, and it was cool, even refreshing. The next thing I felt was pain. It was not bad, but it was there. There was a dull ache through every part of me, cut through here and there by sharp stinging in my arms and legs, doubtless the parting kiss of a slowly shattering window. And beneath me, I realized was stone and dust. My face was pressed against gravel. I opened my eyes. My vision blurry at first, it swam into view, and that view was endless. Gravel, dust and sand stretched away, hills of it rising and falling all the way to the... I slowly pushed myself up to a kneeling position and looked to the horizon. Who knew where I was? But as I slowly raised my eyes until I was craning back, looking directly up, I did not see a vague light, something to grasp for but never reach, something pale and uncertain. Instead, there was something vast, open and blue above me. I saw the sky.